And hey everyone, once again, welcome back to International Organization, and this is a 2-week segment where we examine regional international organizations, so you can kind of take a little slower approach to the material this time around. We don't have to rush through these long chapters. This week we are introducing the understanding of regionalism, and we're looking at NATO. And the following week, I've deemed perfect for just looking exclusively at the European Union. And the EU deserves just a whole week in and of itself, right? If you've read through the EU section of Chapter 5 of the textbook, you just realize how just unbelievably dense it happens to be. And if you've dabbled in the recommended reading by Roy Ginsburg, you begin to realize how in the world does this organization function. But that's for next week, so don't worry about that. This time around, we are, as I said, introducing the uses and the versatility of regional organizations, and we're using NATO as the primary example. And you probably also noted in the syllabus that you don't have to read the entire chapter, right? I just want you to read up to page 195. Recommended, you can read the entire chapter, which incorporates regional organizations in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And while I don't want to suggest that they're not important, examining NATO and the EU is enough, for a class that introduces the subject of organizations. So I figured let's, focus on these two without getting you really bogged down in the specifics. I mean, you can certainly bring in these other organizations for your larger papers, either in the middle or at the end of the semester, but required, I want you to walk away with an understanding of NATO and the EU, and if you can do that, then, we're good. Now, before we get into this, right, I want to just take a little moment here to introduce the idea of regional organizations and regionalism, because we've spent the better part of the last 4 weeks examining organizations as global, right? We spend a good deal of time looking at the League of Nations and the UN, and while they have their uses and while they are certainly important, we've also noted that a lot of these organizations oftentimes stretch themselves too thin and end up not really doing, as much as they would like to. Regional organizations, on the other hand, are much more successful because we are focusing on a geographic specific of the world, smaller numbers of members, and I think a more fine-pointed set of objectives. So regional organization is, in many cases, a form of compartmentalized international governance. So take everything that you've already understood about the UN or the League of Nations or just general theories of organization and apply this into a more condensed, fixed, dedicated region, right, that is focused on a geographic area sharing common political, economic, geographic, we've already said, and security issues. And in this sense, it actually makes the organizations more successful. Not just because membership is smaller, but because there's a greater chance that the members within this organization have, more of a common policy, common interests, common goals. They are geographically contiguous with one another, so it makes achieving the objectives much more likely than the more grandiose, broad-painted strokes that we would get with the UN. What's even more so is that regional organizations have a better opportunity of, embodying a particular mission or an ideal, right? Because the smaller specifics of these organizations, they don't plan, they don't, pretend to be anything bigger than they are. Right? And even the EU, which oftentimes, is led by people who have very, very lofty visions of what the EU can produce. The thing about the EU, NATO, the Arab Union, the non-aligned movement, the Eurasian Union, whatever it happens to be, is that as a regional organization, there's only so far that they can go. There's a point where membership has been, completed, where there is no additional possibility of expanding any further. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that with the inclusion of Northern Macedonia into NATO's ranks just a couple of months ago, NATO has effectively completed any expansion that it ever hopes to really achieve. Countries have either opted to remain out like Austria or Switzerland or Sweden or Serbia, or they just remain outside the geographic area of where NATO can expand, like Georgia, Ukraine, Egypt, Israel, what have you. So the smaller the organization, the more likely the goals and objectives can not only be met, but they can be realized. And so regional organizations are rather good at representing elements of constructivism as they take on sort of a regional mission or ideal. And, when we look at NATO and the EU, they can certainly apply principles of liberalism or at least some liberal objectives to its members. The non-aligned movement, which I will briefly describe in this lecture, can take on more of a Marxist or an anti-colonial perspective. And this is something that the UN can't really do. Right? This is also something that the League of Nations tried to do, but I think its goals were either too lofty or just too abstract for anybody to really take them seriously. And what's more so about regional organizations is that there really is no way to hide the presence of like one or two leading powers within that organization, which serve as coordinating leaders. So, at the risk of, giving the plot away before we even begin, it's safe enough to say that NATO exists largely because of the United States. And the EU exists largely because of the symbiotic relationship between France and Germany. And what's interesting is that, when the EU began, France, I think, was the real founding keystone country. 50, 60 years later, it is clear that Germany is, the alpha country within the organization and the one that probably has the most clout and the most influence. Now, we could, sort of say, well, wait a minute. Doesn't, the United States and Russia and other Security Council members have the same degree in the United Nations? And that might be true, but the problem is that the UN, at least officially, tries to market itself as a forum for all countries. Within regional organizations, the predominant influence of one or two powerful states isn't as inconveniently embarrassing. Right? And I think that there's a good number of members that just sort of unofficially realize that there is, a hegemon or two within the organization. So when we look at, let's say, the Eurasian Union, it's, easy enough to point to Russia and China and say, all right, these are the two big ones. Or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, yeah, China is definitely number one. Russia is a very, very strong number two. And look, let's be honest also, it, takes some of these strong states to shape, mold, and direct these organizations, for additional policy in the years and decades that follow. But before you, walk away and think to yourself, okay, you've convinced me, Rossi, international organization seems to be far better at the regional level. And while that may be true, regionalism does have its limits. Okay? It has its limits because most of the best regional organizations happen to be in Europe. And your textbook does a very, very good job of pointing out that, Europe's collective adherence to the principles of liberalism, or more specifically, liberal institutionalism, gives it the ability to create institutions that are as effective as they are, whether it's the EU or NATO or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OCSC, right? All of these are kind of like the prime examples, right? You want to take a class on international institutionalism. I mean, this is, exhibit A, B, and C for model cases. When we look at regional organizations outside of Europe, right, we find that they're a little bit more loosely oriented. They don't really have the same degree of organization or coordination. The African Union, certainly is one example of this, in which membership is, about 50 or so countries, as opposed to the EU's 28. And the African Union, sounds far more organized on paper and on its website than it does, in its regular meetings. The Arab League is oftentimes fraught with internal problems and power plays between the Egyptians, the Saudis, and the Iraqis. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which, some people would like to think, oh, this could be the future NATO or EU for Southeast Asia. I mean, again, if the states themselves are a bit more self-interested, or if they're not as strong as we would see some of these core industrial countries in Europe, well, then it stands to reason that the organizations are not going to be as influential as well. Now, I don't want you to think that these organizations are useless, but it kind of leads to the understanding that regionalism is only as good as the region under study. And, I had mentioned before, let's say, the non-aligned movement, which was really an organization that had its moment during the Cold War. The non-aligned movement were, and still are, it still exists, a series of countries that, didn't align or ally directly with the United States and its allies, or the Soviet Union and its allies, and sort of taking its unofficial name of being the Third World. So, before we, understand third world countries to be poor and underdeveloped and backwards, third world, at least initially, was just, a collection of neutral countries. Some of the founding members of the non-aligned movement were Yugoslavia, Egypt, Indonesia, and Ghana. Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore. Egypt is, more, operative within the Arab League. Indonesia and, has its own region. Ghana is part of the African Union. So the non-aligned movement is, kind of like the trusteeship council today, right? They still meet, and they still kind of have this, anti-global, sort of, American, critique approach to its foreign policy. But, don't think that they are on the same level as the EU or NATO, right? So regionalism, once again, has its limits depending on the scope, the strength, and the capabilities of the states that make it up. So when we examine strong states like Germany and Luxembourg and France and Italy and Denmark and Netherlands, right, it stands to reason that, NATO and the EU are going to be far more influential. They're going to attract, have a greater track record of attracting additional members, and they're going to wield greater influence in international and global policy. And I think another thing that leads us to, assume that these organizations are a bit more influential is because of the theory that they apply, right? And this is why regional organizations are interesting to study, because they do a far better job in applying the IR theories than the, all-encompassing catch-all global organizations. So at least on paper, right? At least on paper, at least as far as the mission statement, the high glossy, brochure that's sent out to potential interested states, NATO, the EU, and the OSCE engage in applied liberalism. I think the EU does the best job in this, in that, the EU's original purpose is to serve as an economic regulatory body, right? The EU, which we'll get to in a separate lecture, seeks to harmonize and integrate a number of, economic systems of neighboring states. And this is a very, very clear example of commercial pacifism from the school of liberalism. Even NATO, which is by and large a security organization, is not a military alliance per se, as it is an organization whose objective is to provide collective peace, collective security. So it's not an intricate network of the United States and its allies, in so much as being a part of NATO provides a sense of collective security, and also in which the organization does emphasize, maybe not as much as the EU, but it emphasizes that states need to be peaceful, they need to be democratic, they need to abide by certain international laws, they need to uphold a certain number of human rights. And so in this case, there is very much an attempt at applying these liberal theories at a local level and doing quite a successful job, right? Especially when, and I'm once again risking giving the plot line away, NATO's objective is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward, and they don't deter from that objective, and that is, collective military security, which NATO just assumes that its members are going to be some kind of functioning democracy. When we get to other organizations, as I mentioned in the previous slide, we see that some of the other isms come out a little bit more. at least in its inception, the Arab League attempted to apply ideas of Marxism, or at least anti-colonialism. Today, the Arab League's relationship with international Marxism may have more to do with a way of trying to limit the scope and reach of transatlantic influence in the Middle East. But obviously, with countries like Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and Egypt, there is a clear sign of Western transatlantic influence from the United States. The Arab League's probably its primary goal right now in resisting some forms of Western-based encroachment is really the existence of Israel and their rhetorical defense of the Palestinian people. But as years go by, that, as I said, that defense is becomes more rhetorical than actual. The Arab League does, it has its moments, it has its purposes, but it's far less integrative and far less functional than the European Union is. And the non-aligned movement I already described beforehand. It's not worth repeating, but the non-aligned movement is, in a way, kind of like, a theoretical, ideological Marxism that attempted to try to find a third path for many developing states in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. The non-aligned movement still meets today. Serbia is actually still a member. It kind of inherits the seat that Yugoslavia had. But what they advocate tends to just be, as I said, more rhetorically ideological than anything else. When we get to realism, and this is where things get a little interesting because, at least by default, realist theories have little patience, let alone tolerance, for international organizations because they're seen as threats to state sovereignty. And yet, from a realist standpoint, we could lump in NATO, maybe from the point of view of, definitely the United States, which, NATO's continued existence is a way of prolonging and ensuring America's military presence within Europe. We could also say that being part of NATO during the Cold War, provided some kind of self-benefit for its member states in being part of a military collective that defended it against the possible invasion from the Soviet Union and its allies. But one could also say that NATO, from the point of view of, let's say, Italy or West Germany or France, was kind of a way of even diminishing America's potentially raw, capabilities. Now, by being a member of NATO, America was kind of tethered to certain laws and procedures. And so it might have done a number of these countries well to be part of NATO as well because it sort of limited America's potential hegemony, right? So there's even self-interest within, regional organizations. And, by comparison, Warsaw Pact, which no longer exists, Warsaw Pact was Eastern Europe's, the Soviet Union's answer to NATO. The creation of it and the collective membership was first and foremost a way of defending its members against a possible invasion by the U.S., and by connection, NATO, right? So it was, organizations, especially if they take on military objectives, can be very defensive, right? Can be very preservatory, and in ways, sort of affirm some of the policies of even realism. Now, with all of that said, right, regional organizations do contain a number of overlapping shared responsibilities of all of its members. Now, this is nothing new, right? All organizations in some way, shape, or form come with some type of shared responsibilities. But when it comes to regional, again, the membership is smaller, the objectives are clearer, and the capabilities of these member states tends to be much more similar, much more harmonious. So regional organizations certainly coordinate with the UN. NATO does it, the EU does it, all of them do it, right? And this is either through the Security Council, through ECOSOC, through, even the General Assembly. But we see this type of coordination not only by furthering the degree of cooperation and interdependency, not only in further reducing a number of transnational barriers, whether they happen to be economic or cultural or political or diplomatic, what have you, but regional organizations are also likely to produce bloc voting in the UN. And this is particularly the case for non-European, non-transatlantic organizations, right? Like the Arab League, like the African Union, and not as much as it used to be, but it's still there, the non-aligned movement, right? So as far as the UN is concerned, right, especially in General Assembly voting, we talked about coalitions, we talked about bloc voting last week. A lot of this common policy, a lot of this bloc voting comes from these regional organizations that have already, enacted, interpreted policy and have told their members, or influenced their members to vote a certain way when these things come up for debate, in the UN. Another very important element in shared overlapping responsibilities is that being part of a regional organization beyond just the UN, right, increases the number of commitments that states have due to smaller membership. So if these organizations are numbered in, maybe the dozens as opposed to more than 100, and if these organizations are also more surgically oriented to uphold certain principles, right? The EU does economic, NATO does military, right? The Arab League coordinates diplomacy, whatever, and that's it, right? And that's it. It helps to increase the degree of cooperation and interdependency that states within a region may have. And what it also does is, beyond influencing votes at the UN, it harmonizes on a regional, a geographic, a cultural, a linguistic, whatever basis, the number of states to reduce uncertainty and conflict, amongst one another, right? So again, if you've been paying attention and you've been understanding the theories of liberalism and institutionalism, I mean, this is pretty straightforward, right? There's nothing new. There's nothing, earth-shattering, about this stuff. What we need to also look at, and I hinted just a few minutes beforehand, is the particular role of hegemonic states, because it's much more likely for there to be one or two primary coordinating countries within these organizations that do much of the harmonizing, the collectivizing of cooperative ventures, of policy, and of certain ways of thinking. And, in a way, they also have the ability of, at least as far as the EU is concerned, setting the standards, setting the requirements for what aspiring members need to do in order to be part of it. So, we're going to talk about this in greater detail when we get to the EU, but states that want to be part of regional organizations, you can't just simply knock on the door and say, can I join? There are certain things that you need to do. There are certain requirements, certain stipulations, certain benchmarks, whatever it happens to be in order to be accepted. That's very similar to, you want to join a trade union, you want to join a certain college organization, you want to do something, right? You have to apply and you have to meet certain standards, and some of those standards have very stringent requirements. Now, who does the standardization? Existing member states. Who usually controls, the way in which they will be evaluated? Usually the more hegemonic countries, right? The more powerful countries tend to have a say over who joins this year and who doesn't. So again, for instance, as far as the EU, there still are about 5 or 6 countries within Europe that want to get in to the EU. Now, they can't just simply say, I'm in Europe, I want to join. If it were that simple, they'd already be members. But powerful countries like Germany or France or the Netherlands or Denmark, for that matter, might have, a say in whether or not the books are going to be open that year, whether the application will be honored, whether there's a spot at the table for them. And, this kind of denotes the presence of hierarchy and comparative advantage, which, kind of flies in the face of liberalism. As far as realism is concerned, if you're Germany right now, you want to be in the EU because you've got a lot more leverage. If you're the US, you want to continue NATO because it continues and props up your own military leverage and capabilities. So let's then talk. Let's talk about the role of sovereignty because, sovereignty usually diminishes when a state chooses to join. That much is certain. This is just basic theoretical stuff here. But what you pay to get in yields, one should hope, right, greater payoffs. There's a reward. There's a reason, right, for joining. So what's the reason for, let's say, joining NATO, right? It's a union of sovereign nations that pool their resources for collective security, right? So, the price for getting into NATO is you have to kind of give a portion of your military decision-making and spending over to NATO High Command. You no longer have a monopoly on how big your military can be, what you spend money on, and this is even more important, where you buy your stuff from, right? So if you're a member of NATO, it's kind of looked down on buying your stuff from Russia or China or Iran. If you're a member of NATO, you have to adhere to certain guidelines, right? You buy your weapons, you buy your military material from other NATO members, usually chiefly the United States, right? If NATO is called into action, you as a NATO member must, answer the call. And if NATO has, let's say, a peacekeeping mission or some kind of intervention in a country, it is understood that you will contribute to that, right? That's what you give up. You give up a portion of your sovereign decision-making, not only for involvement, but for collective security, as well. It's insurance. Think of it as insurance, however you want. The EU is also an organization that says you're going to give up a segment of your sovereign decision-making, but the payoffs will ostensibly be better. The European Union is an organization that is gradually emerging as a sovereign body coordinating political, economic, and social strategies. Now, don't get me wrong here. The EU is not going to become a state of itself. There will be no United States of Europe, just like there won't be no world government for the UN. But when we get to the EU, it's going to become pretty apparent. The EU's governing apparatus actually has the most oversight, the most intrusive influence on decision-making of national states. So for aspiring members today, right, and the countries that still want to get into the EU but have not yet been offered membership are, in no particular order, Serbia, Montenegro, Northern Macedonia, Albania, Bosnia. Those are 5. Kosovo, we don't really know what Kosovo is. It may come in with Serbia. We'll talk about that next time around. And possibly Moldova. Right? Possibly Moldova. Okay, that's about the extent of it. Turkey, let's not even worry about Turkey, right? But for all of those 5, 6, 6.5, 5.5 countries, stateless territories, whatever, there is going to be enormous oversight from non-accountable, non-electable bodies into the economic, into the political, and the social strategies of each of their members. So the role of sovereignty does become diminished in joining these organizations, but the idea is we pay a little bit to hopefully get something better out of that deal. This may subordinate smaller countries to be more dependent on their larger members. So why would, let's say, a country like Slovakia want to join NATO or the EU, knowing that they're going to be little fish in big ponds? Well, they do so because it opens doors to them, right? It opens doors to Slovakia or the Czech Republic or Hungary or Romania or Bulgaria, what have you, to, at least as far as the EU, greater economic markets. And, as far as NATO, the possibility of collective defense in case a war, happens to break out. Now, they know full well, right? They know full well that they're not really the big decision makers, right? The big decision makers tend to be the more powerful countries. And more often than not, the more powerful countries tend to be the founding countries. So, surprise, surprise, some of the most influential countries in the EU were its original members in 1950, 1951. Croatia joining the EU just, opens up the country to easier access for some of its youth to go find jobs in Austria and Germany, and, to provide Austrians and Germans a cheap vacation in the summertime when they want to go to the Dalmatian coast. But so why does Croatia join? I mean, Croatia joins not because they're expecting to become leaders in the organization, but that they have access to markets. They have access to communication and interaction that they previously, sort of would not have had. So yeah, there is hierarchy in regional organizations, and none of them hide it. Right? It's very much a matter-of-fact case. And so it's not so much controversial or problematic as it is largely seen as a very easy way of choosing to join or remaining on the sidelines. If you're totally okay with the United States sort of, taking the driver's seat in military engagement, then you're going to join NATO. If you're totally okay with Germany and France kind of driving economic policy that may influence your own little small nascent markets, well, then you're going to join the EU. And if you're not happy with it, you'll stay out, as Norway has, Iceland, those Switzerland, those are the two big ones, right? But even here, right, this kind of denotes that there is limits. There is limits to sovereignty, especially when being part of a group involves certain commitments that might conflict with national interests. So, being part of NATO means that you have to take part in some military engagements that you, A, might otherwise not have done, and B, might be very unpopular with its citizens, right? So, for instance, when, NATO's first real military engagement was against Yugoslavia/Serbia in 1999 during the whole Kosovo crisis. And, at that point, both Greece was already a member of NATO very, very early on. Romania joined not too long before the engagement, right, along with Bulgaria. Greece and Romania were very much pro-Serbian. They were very sympathetic with their Serbian citizens, and there were multiple protests in having to take part in the bombardment of what they saw was a friendly and allied country. And it's not a surprise that both Greece and Romania today still continue to support Serbia's territorial claims to Kosovo and do not recognize Kosovo's independence. This plays out within the European Union as well, which I'll get to in just a few short minutes here. Probably more known among the casual observer here was France and Germany's steadfast refusal to kind of march in lockstep with the United States in going to war with Iraq in the late 2002 and 2003. France was so opposed to military engagements that they actively worked to obstruct American foreign policy at as many angles as possible. Germany was a little bit more diplomatic about it. Germany said that they were opposed to militarily engaging in Iraq, largely because Germany was saying, look, this is the first time that we're going to actually have to send troops into a conflict zone. Germans were kind of reprogrammed to think that's not really a good idea. But Germany said to the United States, while we send absolutely no combat troops into the area, we'll keep the air bases open, we'll keep the military hospitals open, we will provide logistical and administrative support, which is exactly what Germany was doing in Afghanistan as well, right? We're not frontline troops, but we will provide certain humanitarian assistance. So Germany was kind of, riding the, rails there. But both France and Germany refused to commit troops to Iraq, which was kind of in violation of, being a member of NATO, but they're large enough and they could, effectively, buck that system. There also is, a number of cases where peer pressure happens to, rear its head, right? Especially in resisting some form of a united diplomacy. So, Great Britain, prior to its leaving the European Union, was, yeah, you're a member, and you're expected to go along with EU policy, but Britain has its own national interests. And, I'll get to it when we do the EU lecture, but Britain's membership in 1972 was kind of like a line item veto membership, right? They didn't just accept membership lock, stock, and barrel. They kind of said to the then European community, look, I'm Great Britain. I'm a big country. I've got a lot of influence, and my legacy as a global power allows me to selectively choose what I want to implement within the European community and what I choose not to. And while that might come with penalties, I'm Great Britain. I don't really care. And that kind of played out up until, 2016, when, Britain opted to leave the EU, and now is the one and only country that has so. France has had a rather tenuous relationship with NATO, largely because France just does not like the fact that the United States is the one that spends most of the money and drives most of the policy and declares most of the wars. France had actually extracted itself from NATO in the 1980s in some form of protest. They didn't really do much. It just kind of isolated France. But, France has been, up until recently, one of the biggest opponents of U.S. foreign policy, using NATO as a way to intervene in countries. And as far as the U.S. is concerned, the United States has had some, its own contentious relationship with the UN. And I may have mentioned this last week, but it's worth repeating. The United States had to be offered a permanent spot with black ball veto on the Security Council as a way of getting them to join the UN at all. So, the history books like to have us think that the United States kind of saw the error of its ways by not being part of the League of Nations after World War I, and, tried to make amends by being an actual contributing member to the UN after World War II. Nay, nay. The U.S. was once again about to go into isolation, and the UN itself had to throw in a whole bunch of sweet deals to the U.S. in order to get them to be on board. Same thing with the Soviet Union. And then as far as the European Union is concerned, in general, it's very difficult to, harmonize 27, 28 members, particularly around certain foreign policies. So the European Union, has to remain neutral on the situation in Kosovo. There are 5 countries of the EU that do not, and, at least 2 of them refuse steadfastly to recognize Kosovo's independence, that is Spain and Cyprus. So the EU cannot have a common policy on Kosovo. They cannot offer Kosovo, any clear signs of eventual EU membership. And the same thing goes for NATO, right? Romania, Slovakia, Greece, Spain, and Cyprus are all members of NATO. And these are the 5 countries that do not recognize Kosovo's independence. This is now extended to NATO being unable to do anything more than see Kosovo as a protectorate, right? The same thing with the European Union. So, regional organizations, they're good. There are limits. There are limits on what they can do. And there are limits on the sovereign decision-making that states can make for the sake of larger, collective decision-making and benefit. Okay? Now, obviously, in spite of all of that, there are benefits, right? There are benefits for joining, which fit in very, simply with basic understandings of institutionalism. For being part of, let's say, NATO, each country can reduce the amount of spending that it would normally do on defense because, if you're a member of NATO, you've got other countries that will, come to your aid. You don't need to monopolize, spending on just the military alone, right? There is some benefits to collective security from group members. As far as the European Union and the Southeast Asian Organization, the Arab League, the African Union, the Organization of American States, there are certainly benefits to economic development in being part of this organization. Augments one's economic capabilities by reducing the amount of tariffs and barriers and tax codes and other obstacles that would impede the flow of capital and capital goods. Particularly within the European Union, there is this, drive to provide as much of a common market as possible. It's sort of in the same way that there is a common market among individual U.S. states, right? You don't have to, change currency at the border between New York and New Jersey. That was a big problem for decades in Europe until the euro was introduced in '99. So the reduction of trade barriers, the promotion of a common currency, a common foreign policy, a common economic policy, basically makes all of these EU states interlocking components into a larger organization. And if nothing else, if capitalist peace theory is facilitated, which is kind of like it's not democratic peace theory and it's not commercial pacifism, but it's kind of like the two together. Interlocking capitalist countries do not go to war with each other. And if you look at NATO, right, none of its members have really gone beyond a few negative words and some threats, and that's usually between Greece and Turkey. In fact, while I'm recording this lecture right now, the last couple of weeks have been pretty volatile for Greece and Turkey. In fact, the countries have been at the brink of war at least 2 times in the last month. But here's the thing, Turkey is not going to open fire, because if they attack Greece, they know that that's an attack on all other NATO countries. And if that does nothing else than avoid the outbreak of actual war, well, then NATO has done its job. When we throw in economic interdependency to that mix, not only does it not make sense to go to war with a military ally, but it makes even less sense to go to war with a country that you're economically dependent on. So, the thought of Germany and France going to war together today is unthinkable. Or Italy and Austria, or Belgium and the Netherlands. It's just absolutely unthinkable. It's just like war has just been eliminated, from these regions. So, yeah, you give up a little bit to join, but look at all the potential payoffs that you could get by being a contributing longtime member, right? Another thing that regional organizations do even better than larger transnational ones is it reduces the level of uncertainty. Man, this liberalism 101. Cooperation opens up greater areas for, diplomacy, communication, harmonizing of interests. It's an open ballot diplomacy. By being part of these multiple organizations, you have to reveal your cards. You can't bluff. You can't hide information. That comes with penalties in that sense, right? And even among the powerful countries, they have to be team players as well, right? The EU is not just simply a way for Germany to just create an economic empire. It might look like that in some cases, but it even will moderate the power of strong states from becoming too hegemonic, right? And this was the idea by creating NATO and even the European Union. Bring a country like Germany that has been responsible for 2 world wars into some kind of institutional cooperation, and we can use their powers of industrial, productivity for good, right? By eliminating the specter, the dangers of ethnocentric nationalism. Look at what we can do with all of these countries working together. Right? And if there are any problems, institutions require states to mediate their disputes in some kind of open dialogue, in some kind of forum. So before we even get to the UN, problems with European states can and should be mediated. If they're both members of the EU or NATO, we can do it there. So before an issue between Greece and Turkey has to come to the Security Council, right? NATO can step in and effectively try to diffuse the tense relations, particularly the rather bellicose attitude coming from Turkey. If Turkey were a member of the EU could intervene before we even get to the UN. Whatever the pattern, whatever the arrangement, right? The limits of uncertainty, the reduction in uncertainty reduces by proxy the security dilemma. Right? It reduces the level of uncertainty that there will be defection, There will be self-help approaches that certain states take. And by eliminating a security dilemma, regional organizations facilitate a foreign policy of trust and mutual assistance. In so many words, the number of layers of institutional organization that states have, the greater likelihood that perfect information will be revealed, especially if cooperation deepens over the years and decades. You cease to see yourself as a rival to your neighbor, and you see your neighbor more as a contributing team player. You're on the same team, you got multiple flags. You got the UN flag, you got the NATO flag, you got the EU flag, you got a whole bunch of other things going for you. If that harmonizes foreign policy, well then congratulations. Organizations have done their job. Okay? All right, let me just take a quick break here before we get into the specifics of NATO. But this is, consider what we've just covered to be the overlapping, overarching theoretical understanding of the versatility and utility of regional organizations, right? I'll just take a quick break and I'm going to come right back with a specific coverage of NATO and how NATO has been one of the most successful regional organizations in modern history. All right, we're back. Actually, if you're listening to the same video, I never really left. This was just an opportunity maybe for you to hit the pause button, grab some coffee, get something to eat, pour yourself a drink, whatever. But I want to continue this discussion by examining NATO, and this should round out the second half of the video. And we will have a separate standalone one for the European Union. Now, NATO is a real easy example, right? There's really nothing confusing. There's nothing, hidden. There's nothing subtle, really, about NATO, right? It is one of the most, if not the actual most, highly successful, highly developed institutions in the international system, right? It is an organization that has clearly defined objectives and an embedded set of micro-level organizations with both the scope and the depth to carry its mission objectives out every time that it needs to do this. The United States is the unquestionable major power. In fact, it is easily understood that the U.S. provides much of the military hardware and financial capabilities. However, I don't want you to think that the rest of NATO's members are, free riding and, enjoying a whole bunch of privileges on someone else's credit card, right? No. If you're a member of NATO, you have to contribute a certain percentage of your GDP. You need to upgrade your, military equipment. You need to reach a certain degree of standard in order to be a contributing member of this organization. But, because it is a dedicated military organization, these objectives are oftentimes very easy to meet. And what's even more so is that NATO is not simply an organization of countries that see non-members as adversaries, right? In fact, NATO has a number of standing arrangements, cooperations, agreements with other countries, other organizations. So cooperation exists beyond just the simple rudimentary understandings of collective security. In fact, as I will show you in one or two slides here, one of NATO's larger, looser associations is with this so-called Partnership for Peace. And PFP it's sort of a weird conglomeration of countries because a number of them were members of the Partnership for Peace before they became formal NATO countries. So for a lot of the aspiring countries of Eastern Europe, to become a member of NATO sort of implied that you had to be on board the larger collection of Partnership for Peace. Some countries remain within PFP and not join NATO. Others are outside of the geographic confines of Europe. So becoming a member of NATO is, somewhat problematic, but you still remain part of that Partnership for Peace. And, whereas NATO's initial establishment was even more clear in providing collective security for Western Europe against the Soviet Union. NATO has evolved, it's developed, it's expanded over the past 30 years or so to move beyond just collective security, but also to incorporate elements of military coordination among its members, foreign policy harmonization, particularly with members of the European Union, and even early efforts at democratization. Now, don't walk away thinking NATO has a political wing. The fact that NATO countries, or the bulk of NATO countries, just happen to be democratic, and there's a very strong overlap between NATO and EU countries, it's kind of hard to factor out the democratic element within NATO. NATO is certainly there to provide more than just simply UN blue-helmeted peacekeepers, right? So when NATO troops are deployed as peacekeepers, you kind of know that the powers that be really want to invest in the area. Right? They don't want to just prolong and avoid conflict, but they actually want to solve something on the ground. So we have NATO troops in Iraq, we have NATO in Afghanistan, we've got NATO troops in the territory of Kosovo, we've got a small NATO contingent in Bosnia, and these are areas that I guess if you see the presence of NATO, you can kind of earmark these areas as high volume, high importance for the United States, the UK, France, Germany, what have you. NATO is an organization that has, as I mentioned, been very successful in expanding its membership, in increasing its brand image. And, the last and most recent country to join, as I mentioned earlier in 2020, was Northern Macedonia. So you see the original founding members of NATO. And, the United States and Canada are part of that, but they're off the map here. So we have Portugal, France, United Kingdom, Norway, Iceland, the Netherlands, Denmark, Luxembourg, and Italy. Shortly afterwards, Greece and Turkey are offered membership in 1952. In fact, Greece and Turkey's membership are what really established the legitimacy of NATO. The two countries, as I've already mentioned, oftentimes come to the brink of war. And, the then U.S. President, Harry Truman, decided that it was, within his interest to bring these two, rival countries within NATO for really two purposes. One, to have them both be members of an organization where they had to contribute, which meant that it was counterproductive from one country to go to war with the other. But also to deny the then Soviet Union any kind of real influence, south of the Black Sea. So by extending NATO's membership to Greece and Turkey, it extends what is really America's military influence across the Mediterranean, right, and seeks to block Soviet encroachment on what will, become an emerging hotspot within the Middle East. West Germany is offered membership in 1955. Spain joins a few years after the death of Francisco Franco, the longtime quasi-fascist dictator, in 1982. And then the real big expansion happens after the Cold War ends, with the first incorporation of East Germany after Germany had unified in 1990, but also to begin including former Warsaw Pact countries. So Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, these were, along with the Baltic states, Latvia, they were part of the Soviet Union. These were all members of Warsaw Pact, right? Sort of the antithesis of NATO. And, it's early on after the end of the Cold War, the big question was, should NATO disband? Seeing as how its objectives have been met, right? Western Central Europe was successfully defended from an invasion that never came from the Soviet Union. So therefore, should NATO just kind of disband and, form something else? As you all know, NATO not only did not disband, but it began to include, membership expanded to include much of Eastern Europe. Later on, we see, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary join in 1999. Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia join in 2004. Croatia joins Croatia and Albania join in 2019. Montenegro in 2017. And finally, Northern Macedonia in 2020. And it's safe enough to hypothesize that with Northern Macedonia's membership, NATO's membership has now reached its limit. As you can see, there are a number of gray countries that are still not members: Ireland, Switzerland, Austria, Bosnia, and Serbia. This already here is the former Soviet Union, Belarus, Russia, Moldova. Sweden and Finland are over here, right? Separate countries. If Ireland, Sweden, Finland, Austria, and Switzerland have not joined, that means that they're not going to join. Ireland and Austria are officially neutral countries. Switzerland, as you know, is so unbelievably neutral, they don't even want to call themselves neutral. Sweden and Finland have had the opportunity, but I believe Sweden is also neutral as well. And Serbia will not join. Popular opinion is heavily against joining NATO, largely because of NATO's bombardment of the country in 1999 and their involvement in administratively separating Kosovo from the rest of Serbia. And Bosnia is so internally divided that it's just absolutely impossible for there to ever be a collective national decision to join NATO. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that NATO may very well have, had its most recent member and final member join this past year, which raises a question which I will bring up at the end of this discussion, whether NATO has any long-term future, right? Well, take that one step at a time. I want to just expand the reach and scope of NATO to make reference to something that I had mentioned about a slide or two beforehand, and that is that NATO does have partnerships and cooperations with non-NATO members. So the current membership is in dark blue, so there's the U.S. and Canada, along with Western Europe here. Greenland is a territory of Denmark, so that brings Denmark in. NATO does have a membership action plan with Bosnia. It is part of some type of individual partnership action plan with Serbia, Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia, and Kazakhstan. The Partnership for Peace, which Serbia and Ukraine are also a part of, but more specific in individual matters, includes, interestingly enough, Austria, Switzerland, and Ireland, along with Sweden and Finland. So in a way, being a member of the Partnership for Peace is kind of like you're going to cooperate with NATO, but you're not part of NATO. So you don't pay NATO dues, you don't surrender sovereign decision-making to NATO. And if you think about it, if NATO has kind of enveloped every conceivable area here to include Russia as well, what are you joining NATO for, right? What are you joining to defend yourself against? So for a country like Serbia, which is surrounded almost entirely by NATO countries, they can cooperate without actually having to join. Then you have a loose connection of states called the Mediterranean Dialogue, which brings in Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania, Jordan, and I would probably imagine Israel, maybe not. I don't know. I can't really check from here. The Istanbul Convention Cooperation Initiative, which brings in members of the Gulf states, and global partners, which, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, I could understand. Afghanistan and Pakistan, more likely because of in NATO's literal presence through the war on terror, which also includes Iraq. And Colombia, interestingly enough, because of local internal conflicts with a number of militarized separatist organizations. So NATO is more than simply its original Cold War intention. NATO is, basically a global military cooperative organization that holds different degrees of partnerships and understandings with, at least a dozen, if not more, states, without having to have their members join them. So NATO is in a very unique position, right, along with the European Union. But NATO is probably even more simplistic, simply because NATO has successfully reinvented itself. Right? The NATO of today is not your grandparents' NATO. It is not the Cold War NATO, right? It is an entirely different, expanded, reinvigorated organization with a number of additional mission objectives having been added to its statement, its idea, after meeting the original goals, right? And NATO's original goal was to contain the Soviet Union and its military allies. And it did so rather successfully, right? The presence of NATO effectively kept the European continent conflict-free for 45 years. And, during the Cold War, it was widely thought that the next big military outbreak would happen in Europe. It would happen over a divided Germany. It would take place, across the border between, let's say, Hungary and Austria or something like that, right? Yugoslavia and Italy. And interestingly enough, not a single outbreak of violence took place. And that also explains, I should kind of mention here, right? That explains why Austria was not a member of NATO. It remained neutral as a way of serving as like a buffer between Warsaw Pact and the West. Yugoslavia was never a member of either NATO or Warsaw Pact. It was a member of the non-aligned movement, but since Yugoslavia's breakup, we can go back to the map here, okay, 4 of its emerging 6 republics have joined: Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro, and Northern Macedonia. So NATO's first real reinvention was deciding not to disband after 1990, and instead expanding into Eastern Europe. And its expansion was not, at least as far as NATO was concerned, it's not meant to be aggressive, nor was it meant to be a threat to Russia. Russia sees things a little bit differently, which I'll just, get to in a couple of minutes here. But NATO's decision to A, stick around, and B, offer eventual membership to Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others was really a way of promising 2 things. One, it was offering the benefits of collective security to states that now saw themselves as potentially vulnerable in a new Europe. Right? Germany is reunified. Soviet Union is no longer there. Central Europe has an unfortunate history of being bargaining chips for larger countries. And, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War's dismantling, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, they all kind of saw themselves as, potential pawns for, a reemerging Germany, maybe a vengeful Russia. And of course, if NATO disbanded, well, it could be a return to the uncertainties of Europe, of the 1920s and 1930s. By NATO sticking around and offering eventual membership to Central Europe, it gave these countries some kind of assurance, right? Some kind of guarantee that they have a future. They have a future as part of a unified, community of European states. And while NATO does not necessarily promote democracy and development, one very interesting, one very strategic thing that NATO had done is that if these countries are on their way towards harmonizing their political, economic, and social institutions to eventually become part of the European Union, membership in NATO is oftentimes given as like a halfway mark, like a benchmark. Like if you're doing a good job trying to get into the European Union, NATO membership is something that can be offered along the way. And if you can get into NATO, chances are you're doing a very good job of very soon becoming a member of the European Union, right? It's kind of like a little reward, a little snack, a little, respite from the years of, structural readjustment. And this was something that throughout the 90s did a significantly good job in stabilizing the political transition of post-communist Eastern Europe. NATO took a more proactive role, however, in the civil wars that disintegrated the Yugoslav state. So, beginning in 91, when conflict erupted within Bosnia and Croatia, NATO gets itself involved in what is becoming an increasingly violent and bloody civil war between Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims in 1995. So NATO's actual first military engagement was a very small surgical military strike against the forward advancing Bosnian Serb units. The goal was not to destroy the Bosnian Serb contingency, but to demonstrate to them that repercussions are eventually going to happen. So it was a way of stopping the violence, stopping the conflict. And NATO's decision to intervene, in the last few weeks and months of the Bosnian Civil War, quickly brings that conflict to an end and brings the Bosnian Muslim, Serb, and Croat contingents to the peace table. And a rather cumbersome peace agreement is carved out, the Dayton Accords. We're going to get to that when we get to conflict resolution. But NATO kind of pats itself on the back and says, hey, look at that, we actually have done something. And, some of its top leaders might think to themselves, we could do this more often, which NATO does again in 1999 when Albanian separatists are fighting an insurgent war against Serb counterinsurgency forces. This time, however, NATO intervenes on behalf of the Albanian separatists and is instrumental in getting the Serbian military contingent to withdraw from Kosovo and, turn it into this international protectorate, quasi-independent state that it is today. But more than just simply operating on its own, right? NATO is unique in cooperating and partnering with other like-minded organizations. So as I just mentioned beforehand, NATO membership can be offered to aspiring EU states, which means that NATO and the EU cooperate quite well. Not surprising, considering that there is almost a one-to-one overlap between EU countries and NATO members. There's a few countries that are in NATO and not in the EU, like Iceland and Norway, and there's a couple of countries that are in the EU but not NATO, like Austria, Sweden, and Finland, right? NATO also works, cooperates with the United Nations. And a number of UN resolutions recently have called for NATO, not UN peacekeeping troops, to intervene in conflict zones. This was authorized in Afghanistan. This was partially authorized with Iraq and Kosovo, although usually the resolutions call for NATO to intervene after the primary conflict has subsided. This also happened with NATO's intervention in Libya about a decade ago during the Libyan civil war that was part of the larger Arab Spring movement. So NATO has been an organization that shows the versatility of adapting, of evolving, of growing, is probably one of the only organizations that is able to do so while kind of still sticking to the fundamental ideological principles of its establishment, and that was providing some kind of collective security for all participating members. And this kind of leads us to examine NATO as a primary example in the dynamics of institutions, right? As far as realism is concerned, right, realism assumes that institutions, if they are to be considered at all, should last only as long as their purpose requires. And in the early years, I would say even early months of the post-Cold War period, right, a number of realists, including many in the United States, John Mearsheimer being one of the big ones. John Mearsheimer is, as I mentioned a couple of lectures ago, one of the preeminent scholars, academics, theorists on realism still alive today. Highly respected individual. And he wrote this article. I think I even mentioned this when we did the theoretical coverage. Mearsheimer wrote this article in 1990 called Back to the Future. It's a rather interesting article in that, I assign it still for my Intro to IR class because Mearsheimer's predictions of what would happen in Europe immediately following the end of the Cold War were about as wrong as you could ever imagine. Like, they're just wildly wrong. Germany would militarize again, seek nuclear weapons. It would work with Russia to kind of, maybe potentially carve up Central Europe, whatever. But I assigned the article not because I want to make fun of Mearsheimer. Far from it. The man is brilliant. But for the larger argument that he was making, and that is all of this stuff is going to happen regardless of whether NATO is still there. The United States, Mearsheimer argued, needed to basically disband NATO, simply because its primary mission was accomplished. The mission was securing Central Western Europe from Soviet aggression, from a Soviet invasion. The fact that Warsaw Pact broke up meant that there was absolutely no need for NATO to be there at all. In fact, Mearsheimer argued, the continued presence of NATO would serve as a constant threat to an emerging Russia out of the, dying husk of the Soviet Union. If NATO was initially established to contain Russia, NATO's continued existence would be viewed by Russia as a potential threat. Therefore, NATO needs to disband. The United States needs to realize that it no longer can afford to be a unipolar hegemon in Europe, right? With the end of the Soviet Union, the United States is now going to be the big superpower. This will work to alienate the U.S. from many European mindsets. So the smart thing to do would be to disband NATO and go back home and let Europe figure out what it wants to do. If Europe wants to create a new military organization without the United States and Canada, and perhaps with Russia, let them do it. Okay? Now, as we know, this did not happen, even though many policymakers at the time were saying NATO is no longer useful. It's redundant at this point. Instead, NATO makes the decision, NATO leaders, including U.S. leaders, make the decision to not only keep this thing going, but to now reinvent itself, to rebrand itself as a guarantor for peace and stability in a politically and economically transitioning Europe. With the understanding among more liberalist scholars, policymakers, and thinkers that if the marginal costs of maintenance, if the marginal cost of keeping the thing going are actually lower than what it would cost in recreating something, effectively the same thing but slightly different, then states will basically choose to, to sustain and augment their current institutional arrangement. In other words, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If it seems to be doing its job, why stop, right? Why stop a good thing? And what's even more so, if a number of countries of Eastern Europe are now looking to NATO, are looking to Western Europe, are looking to America's transatlantic alliance of states and saying, I want to be part of that, right? I want my future to be part of that, then it makes perfect sense to, change just a few of your objectives, expand your outlook, and open the door to, eventual membership. And this is effectively why NATO has been the success story that it is. I think primarily because we can look at it from a number of angles from the U.S. point of view. Right? From a liberalist point of view, the United States is standing in the early 1990s as the global superpower, right? The victor, right? The United States sort of won, quote unquote, won the Cold War by proxy. Single-party authoritarianism has been discredited, and to that, the understanding that communism, Marxism, no longer, has a place in the future. And, what is victorious? not just the United States, but the world that the United States has designed, the transatlantic interconnected economic framework that everyone is now looking to. And shortly after the Cold War's end, right, the age of globalization quickly follows. So the United States, just from an ideological point of view, realizes this is our moment, right? This is our hour. And we cannot just kind of abandon Europe and go back home saying, great, you know what, call us when World War III breaks out. So from a liberalist point of view, the United States realizes it is in a critically important position to now lead by example, to lead by moral principles. From a constructivist standpoint, the United States is the hot item. It's the commodity that everyone wants. So by keeping NATO in Europe, it assuages the fears of many, many countries that, sporadic war, conflict, and fragmentation is going to, somehow break out. And from a hardcore realist standpoint, you're the top dog, yo. Use that advantage. If you decide that you're going to pull your troops out of Europe and go back home, you leave a lucrative theater to someone else. And whether it's the French or the Germans or the Russians or the Brits or whoever, you still have a significant leverage. So the United States goes out of its way to convince potential naysayers in Europe, no, you need us, right? You need us. Besides, here's the best part about NATO. The original purpose was that the United States has a military that's large enough and an economic budget big enough to, take care of the usual, need for defense, right? Each of these European countries can kind of, put away half of their military budget because they don't need to worry. They're part of NATO. It's great. This is the whole notion, right? You're part of NATO. You don't need to spend X amount of dollars or Deutschmarks or francs or pounds or lira or whatever on your military because you got the United States right there and doing it. So, it kind of leads many to say, well, take a look at the German economic miracle of the 50s and 60s. Germany's basically told you can't have a military. When you have a military, bad things happen. You can be part of NATO, and you can have a small contributing element to NATO, but you don't need a big military because the United States is right there. The Germans are like, cool, why not? I'll just take whatever money that I had allocated for economic investment and double that by taking what I would have spent on the military and, put that into the economy as well. And look at how great we're doing. Look at how great Italy's doing. Look at how great France is doing. So Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and others, they're looking at this and like, dude, I want in on this as well. This is fantastic. For a small amount of money, I will, give up my national decision-making responsibilities to create an army, but NATO is going to effectively be there. Right? And take a look at its success stories, right? We have contained any problems between Greece and Turkey. We have successfully integrated West Germany into the alliance of states, so Germany is not going to be that much of a threat. Look at what we've already done by absorbing East Germany, right? After Germany's unification, East Germany automatically becomes a member of NATO. Look at, there's no big problem, there's no ruptures in that as well. And where there are problems, right, particularly within a crumbling, disintegrating Yugoslavia, NATO can be there to, at the absolute least, contain the violence to the Balkans, and at the absolute most, to intervene to prevent war from escalating even further. Okay? And, as far as the Central European states are concerned, we don't know where Russia's going. Now, this is before Putin, but Russia in the 90s was a weird and wild place. I mean, we are just talking about a crumbling country, disintegrating economy, fragmenting politics, a whole bunch of political regional warlords going here, there, everywhere, organized crime. And if you're Poland and if you're Czechoslovakia or Romania, you're just sort of like, that weird neighbor to the east, I don't know what's going to happen. But you know what? It's best if I just buy some insurance and become a member of NATO. Because we don't know what's going to happen, with Russia. And, even if Germany is kind of unified, I'd rather be in the organization with Germany, right? So there's a whole bunch of reasons for joining NATO for these fledgling post-communist countries. Security reasons, collective benefits, collective economics, collective military harmonization, right? And so in this way, NATO doesn't really have to do much to advertise. In fact, the United States could point to Eastern Europe and use them to convince the potential critics and skeptics of France and Britain and Italy as to whether or not NATO should continue by saying these guys want to get in, right? And you're going to need us. Okay? You're still going to need us. We're still here. Y'all look to us for some kind of guidance. So let's just what? Once again, it ain't broke, don't fix it. We got a good thing going. Let's just keep this thing moving, right? NATO has then expanded its roles beyond just a beacon of security to be an interventionist force to eliminate the potential for larger conflict. NATO intervenes officially in Kosovo, in Serbia over the Kosovo crisis in 1999, puts an end to what could have been a larger and more widespread conflict, especially if it's an insurgency, counterinsurgency conflict. That stuff can drag on for years. NATO puts an end to this in about 2.5 months. Okay? After 9/11, NATO gets itself involved, especially when the United States is attacked. NATO uses Article 5 of its Constitution, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. So now it's not just that the United States is going to intervene in Afghanistan, but all of NATO is now mobilized. So this means that the United States has allies. It also means that the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Brits, and others, they're in this. They're in this for the long haul. And if you note here, the 2001 War on Terror is still ongoing about 20 years later. NATO, I don't know whether it expands this or it refines its thing on the War on Terror, but it begins to develop sort of regional. A regional organization has regional objectives, and following the outbreak of a number of protests that challenge dictatorships in the Middle East of the Arab Spring, Libya is about to descend into civil war. NATO intervenes, particularly in Libya, in 2010, 2011. And here's where things get a little controversial, because NATO intervenes on behalf of the rebels against the government of Muammar Gaddafi. Now, Gaddafi isn't necessarily a paragon of virtue, right? He was largely known and remembered as a weird, wacky, unpredictable, and quasi-insane dictator that had run Libya, since the 1970s, siding with what we assumed were pro-democratic separatists. Not only overthrows the Gaddafi regime, ends up with Gaddafi being caught and killed, but then produces a series of smaller civil wars and regional conflicts within Libya, which make it a broken and failed state today. Here's where NATO begins to start taking a number of criticisms alongside with its praise. So that leads us to kind of conclude for the moment here that NATO is not a pitch perfect organization. Far from it. In fact, its involvement even in Kosovo has been somewhat controversial. But NATO, 30 years out from the collapse of the Cold War bipolar system, NATO's membership has expanded, its global mission has expanded, and it does not seem to be any close to disbanding or disintegrating. Yet NATO has a number of current challenges. Probably the most important is defining its role and its relationship with Russia. Right? I mentioned earlier that NATO's decision to expand, at least officially, had little to do with antagonizing and containing Russia. Russia sees it a little bit differently, and I'm not taking Russia's side, but you can kind of understand where Russia is coming from. with the collapse of the Soviet Union into 15 emerging states, right? Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, what have you. There was some kind of understanding, some kind of rudimentary understanding between Russia and NATO that if NATO was not going to disband, it would not move, quote unquote, 1 inch to the east. Okay? 1 inch to the east. NATO, according to Russia's narrative, had made that promise, although it was more of a oral agreement, although Russia says that, physical documents exist to prove its point. But when we say not 1 inch to the east, we have to ask ourselves, are we talking about Central Europe, like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria? Or are we also talking about former Soviet republics? See, it's one thing to offer NATO membership to Poland, or to Hungary, or to Czechoslovakia, even Romania, for that matter. But 3 of the emerging 15 states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, these are countries that we would call the Baltic states, right? They're in, northeastern Europe. They are members of the European Union, and they are now also members of NATO. These 3 countries collectively like to always present themselves as the most anti-Soviet, anti-Russian, anti-communist countries out there. Their history was that they were independent states up to the outbreak of World War II. They were given to the Soviet Union as some kind of plea, as some kind of peace arrangement, post-war arrangement between Hitler and Stalin. So they see themselves as really true victims of the Soviet Union. They overwhelmingly wanted to join NATO. For them, joining NATO kept Russia out entirely. But what this also meant is that now NATO has members, and NATO therefore has an expanded front directly butting into Russian territory. And to this is the constant question as to whether or not NATO will eventually include Ukraine and Georgia, both countries having political leadership that want more than anything else to become a member of NATO to guarantee that Russia will not screw with them anymore. Now, the problem here is that NATO is in this tough position. Do they placate these individual countries at the expense of showing more and more that Russia is an adversary, or even more so a deterrent? Or do they try to live up to their initial claim by saying that NATO is not designed to counter Russia, but NATO can work with Russia as an ally? Now, if that happens, that kind of throws Ukraine and Georgia and others under the proverbial bus, because that means denying them NATO membership, which is going to be and again, the membership itself is going to be controversial. It will be seen as incredibly belligerent towards Russia. But NATO needs to decide what Russia's role is, because if NATO is intervening in Libya, if they were going to almost intervene in Syria, and they did intervene in Serbia, and their interventions effectively targeted governments and strategic interests that Russia saw, then NATO continues to be kind of like an extended military arm of the United States, which kind of prompts Russia to take a couple of actions of its own. Its intervention in Ukraine in 2014, its intervention in Georgia in 2008, where it seized control of 2 breakaway territories, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And it remains to be seen, as I'm recording this, whether NATO will intervene between the conflict now emerging between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Is this NATO's jurisdiction, or is this Russia's backyard, right? And where does the border of NATO end and Russia begin? If NATO says to the world, but more specifically to Russia, that Northern Macedonia's membership in earlier 2020 is the final piece of our puzzle, and we are not seeking any additional members at all, either now or in the future, this could, kind of placate Russia's foreign policy, because that means that no Ukraine, no Georgia, no Serbia, no Bosnia, right? That's all fine and good. If NATO adopts more of a liberalist interventionist policy, and now that I'm thinking about this, if Biden becomes president next January, we could see a resumption of U.S.-Russian hostilities, because Biden is much more likely to kind of restart American foreign policy as this belligerent force for good, and it's going to look at Russia as a proverbial rival. This may very well rekindle ideas within political circles of Ukraine and Georgia that NATO membership could be around the corner. That may prompt Russian responses to take preemptive measures. The other problem that we need to understand is that even if Biden becomes president, the United States no longer has the clout and the authority or the influence that it once had. And I'm not even talking about 30 years ago. I'm talking maybe about 10, 15 for that matter. NATO has already undergone a number of military operations without the United States taking the lead. NATO's involvement in Libya in 2010, 2011 was largely spearheaded by the British and the French. And if this shows to be a recurrent pattern, it means that while the United States is going to continue to be a member of NATO, new countries might start taking the driver's seat, particularly the French. Another big issue, which leads us to think about the French here, is the scope of operations, particularly in the Mediterranean. Because once again, Greece and Turkey are, kind of brandishing their sabers, and Turkey is itching for some kind of conflict. Right? Throughout July and August and September, Greece and Turkey almost came to blows over Turkey's attempt at expanding its maritime and naval presence in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. Rebuffed multiple times, Turkey is now kind of lending money, support, irregular fighters and others to the conflict in Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. The country that we actually see emerging as the big counterbalance to Turkey is France. And under the leadership of Emmanuel Macron, France is kind of becoming the new spokesperson for European collective security against what he sees as an encroaching Turkish threat. If Turkey should threaten war with Greece or threaten Greek sovereignty in many of its islands, France may actually use that as a pretext to mobilize NATO as a way of deterring Turkey. And if this, if the conflict escalates in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, which is in the Caucasus, outside of the European theater, although technically speaking, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia are kind of sort of in Europe, NATO could be called to intervene there as well, right? Both remain to be seen. We also know that NATO just does not kind of go wherever its, primary leaders want, as we saw with NATO's limited cooperation in the Second Gulf War. Right? So NATO does not formally mobilize to overthrow the regime of Saddam Hussein in 2003, largely because the French and the Germans don't want any part of it. The United States does, Great Britain does, Eastern Europe, eager to show its newly found commitment, mobilizes. But NATO will sometimes operate at half capacity if it is seen that the mission lies outside of the ideological objectives or the parameters of what NATO can do. So that leads us to say that, NATO is kind of not the be-all, end-all organization for, the number of challenges to collective security in 2020. We find that NATO is, in multiple areas, increasing its presence in the Mediterranean, deepening partnership with Northern Africa to the point of saying, if Canada and America can be part of what is now really a European military alliance, what's to stop, Algeria from joining, or Morocco, or Japan, or Israel for that matter, right? The name of it is North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but there's nothing North Atlantic about Albania, or Greece or Turkey for that matter. So do we continue to evolve this organization within the very specific parameters of collective military security? Right? There's a lot of things that we can talk about when we reconvene for class on Monday. So if you have if you've read through that part of the chapter in the textbook, and you've also covered it's now increasingly dated material in the Celeste Wallander article, but the Wallander article is good for pointing out NATO's institutional adaptability. You should be in good shape. You should be in good shape for some kind of, collective exercise, some group discussion in class on Monday. So that brings us to the end of part one of this two-part lecture. Next week, we will focus exclusively on the European Union. So make certain that you've got the sections of your textbook for that read. And if you are, daring enough, you can dabble into the recommended readings for that as well. But we're going to save the EU for next week. I'd like to see how well you are able to master a discussion on NATO for this week. So enjoy the rest of the weekend. I look forward to seeing you in class on Monday. And as always, stay healthy and stay sane. See you all.